Hello, welcome to the webinar Disability and Climate Change, a look at the Paris Agreement 10 years later. In this webinar, I'm going to talk about what the Paris Agreement is, how people with disabilities are included in the Paris Agreement, and what the progress has been to include people with disabilities and to move forward, what the priorities are in ensuring that people with disabilities are included in the Paris Agreement and included broadly in um, efforts to address climate change. So first, in terms of the Paris Agreement itself, the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC, is the foundational UN treaty for global climate action, called informally the Paris Agreement. The Paris Agreement was adopted in 2015. We joined in 2016. We withdrew in 2020. We rejoined in 2021 and again withdrew in 2025 when President Trump issued Executive Order 14162 directing our withdrawal. So, in spite of the fact that we are not member of the Paris Agreement currently, it is still a template for international cooperation with respect to climate change. And the Paris Agreement itself has five elements. The first is a temperature goal, and the temperature goal is about minimizing global warming and ensuring that the temperature doesn't rise by more than 2 degrees each year. Really, the goal is to keep it below 1.5 degrees. Um, but that's the efforts being made that internationally countries agreed to. The 159 countries that signed on agreed to aim for reducing global warming and keeping the temperature standard. The next element of the agreement is mitigation, and this element talks about countries submitting what's called the NDC, nationally determined contributions, which are their individual plans to cut emissions to address climate change. The third is adaptation. So we're trying to mitigate climate change, but we also recognize it's happening. So adaptation speaks to what are we doing to ensure that people are still able to live even as the climate is changing? What are we doing to adapt the ways that we create power? What are we doing to adapt the ways that we live, the places we live, to ensure that we're mitigating climate change as well? What are we doing with our forests and our deserts? How are we adapting them and adapting our life in them to make sure that we can continue to survive? How are we coping with global climate change? Transparency and global stocktake is really about an agreement that the countries that signed on to this made to do a 5-year cycle of review and to share that data. So, what's happening in our countries with respect to climate change and how are we putting in plans to address it? And then the last is finance and solidarity. And in finance and solidarity, what's happening there is um, that we are committing to putting money and energy and efforts into addressing climate change and mitigating climate change. And we're agreeing to do it for each other. So if there are other countries that need support, um, financial support if necessary, we're providing that support for them as well. So why focus on people with disabilities when you're making your climate um, plans, mitigation plans, and adaptation plans? Well, the first reason is that people with disabilities are disproportionately vulnerable to climate change. So many people with disabilities struggle with the environments that they're in pre-climate change without any impacts of it. We're not able to just move through water if there's flooding. We're not able to live in hotter conditions if there's global warming. So people with disabilities are disproportionately negatively affected by climate change and more vulnerable as a result. Also, climate change plans are not going to be effective unless they include and incorporate people with disabilities. So if we're concerned about the effectiveness of our climate plans and our solutions, they need to be effective for everyone, and so they need to be able to be broadly applicable. Um, it is also true that climate plans are more effective if people with disabilities are part of designing them, and I'll talk a bit more about that later. In terms of justice and equality, we have an obligation to ensure that people with disabilities are thought about and prepared for in the plans that we make. And so there's justice and equality issues. And then lastly, it's a missed opportunity if we're not considering people with disabilities as we make these plans. Um, People with disabilities make up about 20% of the international population. So if we're not considering their needs, we're keeping a vulnerable population still vulnerable and perhaps more vulnerable than they were before. Okay, so in terms of principles of inclusion, um, like what are the reasons behind making decisions about climate change? Um, what what guides us in making the decisions that we make about how we move forward. The first one is just across the top human rights. It is a human rights issue to consider and incorporate people with disabilities into any climate change actions. Um, those actions must respect, protect, and fulfill the human rights of people with disabilities. In fact, the Convention on Human Rights, the UN Convention on Human Rights, directs us to do that. The second reason that's part of the principles of inclusion is ensuring full participation. And I mean this from the very beginning of any climate action. So, in the planning stages, in the analysis and assessment stages, how are people with disabilities being impacted? How will they be impacted? What are their additional needs? I mean it from that point all the way through the implementation of any policies that are to mitigate or address climate change. There must be people with disabilities included in those. In terms of accessibility, any climate information, data, systems, emergency planning and emergency information, all of that needs to be accessible to people with disabilities. And that ranges from physically accessible to having that information in Braille and everything in between. And then lastly, intersectionality is really important to consider because while people with disabilities make up 20% of the international population, it crosses other groups and classes. So those people with disabilities are also people of color, are also people in low socioeconomic groups, are also single parents or women. So it's really important to consider that as well. And in terms of our key action areas, our NDCs, our national policies or nationally determined contributions, are critical action areas. And these are the plans that each country makes. So the plans that each country makes must consider disability specific needs and have disability specific goals, action plans, and budgets set aside. In terms of adaptation and resilience, it's really critical to develop and be able to implement, be able physically, be able financially to implement accessible climate adaptation plans that consider the needs of people with disabilities and strengthen disability inclusive social protections for any climate emergencies or climate shock. In terms of disaster risk reduction, as I said before, people with disabilities can often be disproportionately affected by climate disasters. So it's really important to make sure that those plans are accessible and to consider the needs of people with disabilities. In With respect to green economy, and you'll see later on, there's a bright spot there, but that is about ensuring that people with disabilities are part of our efforts moving forward to greenify, to build a green economy. They need to be part of that process as well. And then lastly, data and monitoring. As we collect data, um, we have to collect data about how climate change is impacting people with disabilities, as well as how our plans to mitigate it are improving circumstances for people with disabilities. We need to track this progress, monitor, and address any gaps. In terms of the bright spots, so there are a few bright spots of countries that have really taken to heart the charter here to support people with disabilities with respect to climate change plans. So Vanuatu, Bangladesh, Nepal, Costa Rica, and Canada are all countries that are integrating disability concerns into both their mitigation efforts and their adaptation planning. All of them have developed specific programs, budget allocations, and commitments to participation for people with disabilities. So people with disabilities are included in all of the different aspects of climate relief planning and implementation. In Somalia, Somalia is providing for the development of accessible and climate resilient healthcare infrastructure so that if people are experiencing impacts of climate change, the healthcare infrastructure will support them in that, and specifically looking at how to do that for people with disabilities. In Mauritius, Bangladesh, and Cambodia, there's been commitments made to constructing accessible disaster shelters. It's great to think about evacuation plans and emergency plans and shelters, but if you literally are not building plans that people with disabilities can follow or shelters that are accessible for people with disabilities, you're leaving those folks behind. And then lastly, in Moldova and Sri Lanka, those countries describe specific programs that include people with disabilities in the transition to a green economy. So they've found the ways to ensure that people with disabilities are part of this progress and movement forward. So that's the good news. Unfortunately, there are lots of places where progress has not been made. I'm going to look at two reports. One of those more comprehensive than the other, so I'll talk more about the other one. But this one was a report done in 2022 from the International Disability Alliance and International Disability and Development Consortium. And they found that only 39 of the 195 countries that signed onto the Paris Agreement make reference to people with disabilities, excuse me, in their plans. So that's only 20%. 7 years after the Paris Agreement was made. In 2025, 10 years after the Paris Agreement was made, another assessment was done. And in this assessment, they discovered that 44 of the 195 companies that signed on to the Paris Agreement mentioned people with disabilities in their plans. That's 22%, up from 20. But only 14% of the 195 countries include concrete measures to advance inclusion. 72% of those 195, that's 36%, sorry, 72 of the 195, which is 36%, do not include any mention about people with disabilities in either their nationally determined contributions, their plan, or their adaptation policies. So 64% of the countries are leaving people with disabilities out of the bulk of their planning. Even the plans that do reference people with disabilities generally do so broadly without concrete measures to protect or involve people with disabilities in climate action. So, what can we do? What's the way forward? So, in spite of the fact that analysis concludes that most countries are neglecting their obligation to include people with disabilities in the plans and the planning process itself, in spite of the fact that gains are modest, and that exclusion of people with disabilities increases the disproportionate risk for people in disability communities, we need to take the disability rights approach. And what that means is that we can step back, assess, and address the impacts of climate change for people with disabilities. This will ensure that people with disabilities' needs are met, and this process then asks for people with disabilities to be part of the full process, from thinking about what are the impacts that are happening now and are going to happen with climate change, to what are the adaptation and mitigation policies that we should develop. This is the expectation from the Human Rights Commission, and it's the way to ensure that everybody's needs are met when it comes to responding to climate change. People with disabilities should be included in climate governance. Countries should recognize their unique knowledge and their abilities to problem solve, that they're a voice and a perspective that's critical to successful climate change policies. Lastly, we should develop concrete measures for mitigating climate change, ensuring safety and providing support for those living with disabilities. And none of this can be done without including people with disabilities in these conversations and in this process. So it's really about reaching out and making sure that people with disabilities are part of all of the plans that countries put together. I appreciate your attention to my webinar, And I'm going to just leave you with a couple of additional resources. The first three here are videos about climate change. And then the last one is a summary of the Paris Agreement in case you wanted to look into that more. Thank you so much.